Could you survive a single day in Tudor clothing? Not the polished gowns from television. The real thing. 10 pounds of velvet in the summer heat. Corsets stiff enough to reshape your ribs. Ruffs that locked your neck in place, and layers designed not for movement, but for status. In Tudor England, clothing was more than fashion. It was a battlefield, a currency, a cage. Today, we suffer for beauty in subtle ways, but the Tudors, they suffered out loud, stitched into every seam they wore. So let's step into their world. Let's test a simple challenge. If you woke up tomorrow morning and had to dress like a Tudor noble, would your clothes honor you or punish you before breakfast? The Tudor world unfolds. The Tudor age was one of contradiction, opulence wrapped around discomfort, elegance stitched to agony, appearance valued far above practicality. This was a world where a gown could determine your future, where a man's doublet could broadcast his loyalty, where color, fabric, and silhouette could elevate you or end you. But fashion didn't exist in a vacuum. It sat at the intersection of politics, religion, economics, gender expectations, and human vanity. From Henry VIII's padded shoulders to Elizabeth I's towering collars, Tudor fashion was a theater of power. Yet beneath the gold, there was sweat. Beneath the pearls, there was pain. Beneath the beauty, there was burden. Today, we examine the Tudor fashion paradox. Why did a society obsessed with magnificence willingly choose discomfort? And what does that reveal about their world and about ours? To understand the Tudor obsession with appearance, we must first confront the physical reality of dressing like one. The weight, the heat, the restrictions, the unseen torture stitched into every layer. Let's begin where every Tudor day began, with the ritual of dressing. Not elegance, not glamour, a ritual. Because for the Tudors, especially the wealthy, getting dressed wasn't something you did. It was something that was done to you. The morning prison picture. This. You wake before dawn inside a cold Tudor chamber. The fire has long died out. Your bones ache from a mattress stuffed with straw, not feathers. Before you can stretch or walk, the door opens. 2 attendants step in. Women for a lady. Men for a nobleman, carrying layers of fabric, linen, whalebone, wool, and silk. You are not asked how you feel. You're not asked what you want to wear. Your rank determines everything. They begin layering your body with the precision of armorers preparing a knight. First, the linen shift. A simple undergarment, the only soft layer you will feel all day. Then the transformation begins. The corset, reshaping the body. The Tudor corset, called stays, was not the curved Victorian hourglass we imagine today. It was straight, flat, and rigid, made of whalebone, buckram, heavy stitching, and sometimes iron. Its purpose wasn't just shaping, it was controlling. It forced the torso upright, flattened the chest, and compressed the ribs. Breathing became shallow. Your diaphragm had no space to expand. And this wasn't a fashion mistake. It was intentional. A stiff torso signaled discipline, elegance, nobility. The ideal Tudor woman wasn't meant to move with freedom, but to stand with authority. Even teenage girls wore stays. The body was trained from youth. For men, the equivalent was the doublet, padded, quilted, stiff, and tight. It exaggerated the chest, broadened the shoulders, and announced masculinity. Either way, your spine belonged to fashion now. The farthingale, a cage disguised as style. Next comes the farthingale, a stiff, cone-shaped hooped skirt originally from Spain. To us, it looks grand and theatrical, but to the Tudor woman wearing it, it was a prison of wood, wire, or whalebone. The farthingale forced women to move with tiny steps. Sitting required technique. Doorways required turning sideways. Dancing required coordination. And heat. Imagine wearing a tent around your lower body with zero ventilation in a Tudor summer while fires burned constantly indoors. A silhouette meant to elevate status trapped the body inside a cage. But the bigger the skirt, the higher the rank, and so the suffering continued. Sleeves that were not attached, one of the strangest Tudor realities. Your sleeves didn't belong to your gown. They were detachable, tied on with ribbon points, and made separately. A noblewoman might own 50 sleeves for 10 gowns, but all that decoration came with a price. The sleeves restricted movement more than the bodice. Reaching overhead? Impossible. Stretching forward? Difficult. Running? Out of the question. Everything in Tudor elite dressing was designed to slow you down. To make your movements deliberate, to show the world that you are not a laborer, but someone important enough to be physically immobile. The ruff, the most beautiful torture device in fashion history. If one garment symbolizes Tudor discomfort, it is the ruff, a starched pleated collar, sometimes 20 inches wide. It forced your chin upward, locked your neck, and prevented turning the head quickly, lowering the head, eating comfortably, speaking loudly, or showing weakness. The ruff was meant to create a halo of status. It framed the face like a portrait, but wearing one was agony. Starch made it sharp. Wire supports bit into the shoulders. Sweat collected underneath. You could barely swallow without feeling pressure. Elizabeth the Reign's largest ruffs were practically instruments of confinement. To appear divine, one had to suffer. Weight, the burden of wealth. Modern clothing weighs grams. Tudor elite clothing weighed kilograms. A fully dressed noblewoman could carry 10-20 pounds of fabric. A nobleman, depending on layers, up to 15-25 pounds. Velvet was heavy. Brocade was dense. Embroidery added metal threads. Jewels were sewn directly into clothing. A single gown could cost what a laborer earned in a year and weigh as much as a toddler. Every step was labor, every movement deliberate. Imagine climbing stairs in this. Imagine dancing. Imagine walking through court corridors lined with people watching your every breath. Every bead of sweat, every wince, every misstep was witnessed. Because Tudor fashion wasn't personal, it was public performance. Heat, hygiene, and hidden misery. Tudor buildings trapped heat. Large fires burned indoors. Windows were small. Ventilation was poor. Now add 5 to 7 layers. Fur trimming, heavy wool, starched collars, no deodorant, and rare bathing. The body suffocated. The skin blistered. Rashes developed where the stays rubbed. Women fainted in summer heat. Men overheated in doublets and cloaks. But fainting was not weakness. It was fashion. Ladies in waiting carried smelling salts. Nobles expected dizziness. It was normal. A body collapsing under the weight of status was simply part of being elite. The psychological cage. But the gilded cage wasn't only physical. Clothing controlled. Posture, movement, breath, expression, social behavior. Your body no longer belonged to you. It belonged to the display. This is why Tudor fashion becomes so fascinating. The clothes were not designed for life, they were designed for symbolism. A Tudor noble didn't need to be comfortable. They needed to be seen. To understand Tudor fashion, we must understand the rule that governed their entire world. Clothing was not self-expression, it was social declaration. Every garment you put on, its color, its fabric, its trim, even its shape, announced your worth, your lineage, and your place in the hierarchy. In Tudor England, you didn't just wear clothes. You wore evidence. evidence that you belonged, that you mattered, that you obeyed. Sumptuary laws. The Tudor dress code of power. Imagine laws today telling you which colors you're allowed to wear based on your income, which fabrics are too elite for you, which styles are forbidden unless the king grants permission. This was the Tudor world. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear purple, reserved for the royal family, who could wear scarlet, high nobility only, who could wear ermine fur, whether you were allowed jewels on clothing, whether your gown could have gold thread, whether your cloak may be lined with sable, how wide your sleeves could be, how long your train could extend behind you. These weren't suggestions, they were legal boundaries. Wearing clothing above your station could mean fines, confiscation of garments, public shaming, or direct punishment from the crown. In a world obsessed with order, your clothing was your passport. It told others exactly who you were, before you ever spoke a word. Why such strict rules? Because Tudor England was built on hierarchy. Rigid, visible, unquestioned hierarchy. The elites needed to look untouchable, not equal to those beneath them. If everyone could dress like nobility, how would society know who deserved respect, who deserved obedience, who was born superior? And so clothing became a stage, an actor's costume in the theater of power. Elizabeth I, the master of fashion as propaganda. No one understood this better than Queen Elizabeth. She weaponized fashion. Her collars were enormous, her sleeves extravagant, her gowns layered with pearls, lace, and embroidery, her colors symbolic. White for purity, gold for majesty, black for authority. When she entered a room, the visual impact was overwhelming. She did not need to speak. Her clothing spoke for her. Foreign ambassadors recorded their shock at the sheer brightness of her wardrobe. Some described her as a moving icon, others as a sun surrounded by lesser planets. Even when she grew old, Elizabeth concealed her aging behind. Chalk white makeup, wigs of vibrant red hair, structured gowns that hid her shrinking frame. Her image was carefully constructed, painfully maintained, obsessively controlled, because to rule a divided kingdom, she needed to be myth, not mortal, and her clothing became the armor of that myth. Henry VIII, fashion as intimidation. Henry I, too, understood the power of appearance, but in a very different way. While Elizabeth used fashion to appear divine, Henry used it to appear dominant. His clothing emphasized broad shoulders, padded chests, enormous sleeves, heavy chains, jeweled cod pieces, luxurious fur. Every outfit was designed to make him look larger, stronger, and more powerful than every man in the room. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold, his famous meeting with the King of France, Henry wore a garment covered in over 1,000 pearls, embroidered with gold thread, weighing more than some soldier's armor. The message was clear: I can afford comfort, I can ignore practicality, I'm above labor, I am above you. The court, competition, and survival. In Tudor court life, fashion wasn't merely decoration, it was survival. A noblewoman could rise or fall based on the richness of her gown, the sparkle of her jewels, the precision of her embroidery, the elegance of her silhouette. And this wasn't vanity, it was politics. A woman dressed flawlessly could attract royal attention, secure a powerful marriage, impress ambassadors, honor her family, gain patronage, avoid ridicule, and protect her reputation. One fashion mistake, however, could destroy her. A stain, a torn hem, a ruff that drooped, a gown a day out of date. Everything was noticed, everything was judged. Anne Boleyn understood this perfectly. She revolutionized English fashion with the French hood. Sleeker, more sensual, more dangerous. Her style became her weapon. Her elegance helped her climb to the position of queen. Her failure to maintain it could have been interpreted as weakness, something the Tudor court never forgave. The economics of display. All this spectacle came at a cost, a staggering cost. A noblewoman's annual allowance for clothing could equal an entire village's yearly income. Records show gowns costing £40, £60, £80. In modern terms, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. Elite wardrobes contained dozens of gowns, ribbons imported from Italy, lace from Flanders, pearls from the Mediterranean, gold thread from Venice, fur from Russia, dyes from Asia. Why spend so much? Because in Tudor England, wealth had to be seen to exist. If you didn't display it, people assumed you didn't have it. Men were no exception. We often focus on women's clothing, but Tudor men were also bound by the same logic. A man's doublet, hose, and cloak announced his profession, his education, his income, his political alliances, his level of influence. A poorly dressed man was seen as unreliable. A fashionable man, ambitious, impressive, trustworthy. And so Tudor men too became peacocks, their feathers woven, stitched, padded, and dyed. Fashion as fear. But beneath the beauty was fear. Fear of being judged, fear of being outshone, fear of being accused of imitating a rank above your own, fear of committing a fashion offense that implied rebellion. Tudor clothing was a battlefield where one wrong choice had consequences. In a world where clothing defined status, status defined survival. We've seen the weight, we've seen the restriction. We've seen how clothing became a weapon of social power. But the Tudor fashion paradox goes deeper, because for all its beauty, it was ruinously expensive, brutally demanding, and relentlessly unsustainable. This is the side of Tudor fashion we rarely hear about, the cost that wasn't glamorous at all. The financial burden of being seen. In Tudor England, your clothing wasn't a choice, it was a requirement. A noblewoman who appeared in court wearing last season's style, or with a gown less ornate than those around her, risked being seen as poor, out of favor, unfashionable, or socially declining, and reputation mattered more than comfort, sometimes even more than honesty. To survive court life, a woman needed a wardrobe that could impress, intimidate, evolve, demonstrate loyalty, and signal wealth. This pressure forced families into enormous spending. A single elite gown could cost $20, $80, massive sums for the era. And even more if decorated with gold thread or pearls. This would be equivalent to several $1,000s today, sometimes more, and women didn't own just one gown. Records show noblewomen keeping 20 long gowns, 40-60 detachable sleeves, multiple farthingales, velvet cloaks, embroidered partlets, French hoods, English hoods, coifs, sets of pearls, ribbon collections, shoes imported from Spain or Italy. All these items had to be replaced, repaired, updated, or restarched. Fashion was not a luxury. It was an industry. Behind a single gown were dozens of workers. A Tudor garment was not made by one tailor. It required spinners, weavers, dyers, starch makers, embroiderers, lace makers, seamstresses, and sometimes jewelers. If a gown had gold thread embroidery, each inch of stitching could take hours. If it had pearls, each pearl was attached by hand. A ruff could take 3 full days to pleat correctly, and then it had to be maintained. Starchers reshaped the ruffs weekly. Laundresses washed linen shifts in boiling water. Dressers aired gowns to prevent mold. Tailors constantly adjusted sizing due to corset changes. Behind every beautiful Tudor portrait was an unseen army of exhausted workers, and the wealthier the wearer, the more labor they consumed. The psychological price of perfection. The pressure was relentless. women of high status could not repeat a dress too often. They could not appear in court looking less bright than usual. They could not have sagging sleeves or wrinkled skirts. They could not let the collar droop. Drooping meant disrespect. Every public appearance was a test, every gathering a competition, every walk through the palace corridors an evaluation. Imagine living in a world where your clothing determined your reputation every single day, where gossip about your gown could ruin your marriage prospects, weaken your political alliances, insult your family, or embarrass your household. Tudor fashion wasn't fun. It was pressure, constant, crushing pressure. The health cost, the body under siege. We often admire Tudor portraits without realizing the pain invisible beneath them. Corsets, compressed organs. Bruising along the ribs was common. Some young women developed breathing problems. Farthingales caused hip and back strain, especially in older women. Jeweled girdles added extra weight to the waist. Heavy trains pulled on the lower back. Starched ruffs irritated skin and restricted swallowing. Elizabeth I's ruffs were so tight that ambassadors described her voice as constrained. Men fared no better. Padded doublets caused overheating. Layered hose restricted circulation. Fur-lined cloaks in summer caused faintness. But appearance was everything. Suffering was ignored. In a world that worshipped grandeur, comfort was almost sinful. Servants felt the burden. 2. Fashion didn't only affect those who wore it. It impacted those who maintained it. Consider a laundress washing heavy linen shifts in boiling water, an embroiderer whose eyesight failed early from hours of fine stitching, a starcher inhaling toxic fumes from yellow starch, a tailor working long nights by candlelight, a maid carrying heavy gowns across the palace. These workers weren't celebrated. They weren't named in portraits. But Tudor fashion relied on their suffering. Even the poorest women copied elite styles with cheap fabrics, which led to discomfort without any of the luxury. Everyone paid a price, just at different scales. Waste and excess, the hidden environmental cost. The Tudors lived in a world before synthetic dyes or plastics. Their dyes came from nature, and harvesting them had consequences. Purple came from rare shellfish, bright red from cochineal imported across continents, blue from woad, which exhausted soil, black from iron salts, which damaged fabric and skin. Elite fashion was built on exotic imports, long trade routes, and immense waste. Aristocrats sometimes discarded gowns after a single season, not because they were damaged, but because they were no longer fashionable. To keep up appearances, entire outfits were abandoned like trends today, only slower, but no less wasteful. The social cost, clothing as a divider. Fashion did not unite Tudor society. It divided it sharply. Clothing told you who you could marry, who you could talk to, who you could serve, who you must obey, who you must avoid. A servant dressed too finely might be accused of theft. A merchant wearing the wrong color could be accused of pretending nobility. A widow wearing unsuitable black might be judged as disrespectful. Even in death, clothing dictated ritual. Everything was symbolic, regulated, and scrutinized. Narrator: the Tudors lived in a world where image was identity, and identity was destiny. When fashion became a trap. The great irony of Tudor magnificence is this: the clothing that gave you status also imprisoned you. A noble woman couldn't travel freely. She couldn't move quickly. She couldn't run, climb, bend easily, or lift heavy objects. She lived inside the silhouette society demanded. A nobleman couldn't appear without his doublet, even in unbearable heat. He couldn't reveal weakness. He couldn't dress plainly without damaging his reputation. Fashion freed no one, not even the powerful. Up until now, we've lived in the world of palace corridors, velvet trains, and jeweled sleeves. But those outfits belong to less than 1% of Tudor England. What about everyone else? What about the farmers, the brewers, the midwives, the artisans, the sailors, the servants, the market women, the people whose daily labor kept the kingdom alive? It's here, among the ordinary Tudors, that we discover a different side of fashion, less glamorous, more practical, and far more revealing of the time. The reality of clothing for the majority. Most Tudors owned very few clothes. A farmer might own one woolen gown, one linen shirt, one pair of hose, a patched doublet, one cloak for winter, maybe 2 pairs of shoes in a lifetime. A laborer's wife might own one everyday kirtle, dress, one better quality gown for church, linen shifts washed frequently, an apron, wool stockings, a coif or headscarf. Clothing was expensive, handmade, and slow to produce. Everything had to be mended, reused, repurposed, and eventually turned into rags. Nothing was wasted. In a world before fast fashion, your wardrobe told your life story. Every tear, every stain, every repair. The materials of survival. Poorer Tudors wore materials built for life and labor. Wool, the most common fabric. Warm, durable, versatile. Scratchy, yes, but reliable. Linen used for undergarments. Absorbent, breathable, washable. Linen shifts were washed often. They absorbed sweat so the outer gown didn't have to. Leather used for shoes and belts. Shoes were heavy, often uncomfortable, but essential. Homespun cloth rough, uneven, practical. Nothing about these materials shouted elegance, but they did shout survival. Colors for the common folk. The dyes available to ordinary people were simple. Browns, grays, greens, russets, dull blues. These colors came from plants, bark, onion skins, walnut shells, or local minerals. Bright colors, scarlet, deep purple, shining gold, were reserved for the elite by law and by cost. A farmer wearing crimson, impossible. A merchant's wife wearing purple, illegal. Clothing was a visual map of class. Anyone could read it instantly. The workday wardrobe. Tudor clothing wasn't designed for comfort, but it was designed for endurance. A brewer's apprentice needed sleeves tied back. A fisherman needed wool to keep him warm even when soaked. A baker needed clothing that wouldn't ignite near ovens. A midwife needed layers she could remove quickly. And yet, even among the working class, expectations remained. A woman was expected to cover her hair after marriage, a sign of modesty and respect. A man was expected to appear tidy and presentable, even if his only clothing was patched beyond recognition. No matter how simple life was, appearance held meaning. The weight of respectability. For ordinary Tudors, the biggest fashion pressure wasn't luxury. It was respectability. A woman who appeared in church with a torn kirtle, uncovered hair, or a smudged apron risked shame, judgment, rumors. A man who appeared without his hat was considered disrespectful, maybe even rebellious. Even in poverty, everyone played their role. The Tudors didn't dress for comfort, they dressed for reputation, at every level of society. Seasonal misery. England was cold, bitterly cold in winter. Poor Tudors lacked proper insulation. They layered wool, but wool retained dampness. If it rained, their clothing stayed wet for hours. If snow fell, it stiffened the fabric. In summer, their clothes became ovens. Layers trapped heat. Sweat soaked linen shifts. Wool chafed against the skin. But clothing was too precious to rotate. You wore what you had, whether the weather cooperated or not. Children and clothing. Children suffered the most from limited wardrobes. A child might own one shift, one pair of hose, one gown, maybe a cap. When they outgrew clothing, which happened often, garments were let out, cut down, resewn, passed to younger siblings, or turned into scraps. Childhood did not escape the hierarchy of apparel. A wealthy child's clothing announced privilege. A poor child's clothing announced struggle. Festive clothing, a glimpse of color. Despite the hardship, ordinary Tudors weren't joyless. On feast days, market fairs, and festivals, many wore their best outfit. A woman might add a ribbon of dyed cloth. A man might polish his leather shoes. Children might wear something hand-me-down, but still new to them. These moments mattered. They allowed poorer Tudors to taste a spark of beauty in a world where fashion was otherwise a chain. When fashion became dangerous, even working-class clothing could cause difficulty. Loose sleeves could catch fire, long skirts dragged through mud and disease. Shoes lacked arch support, causing pain. Wool trapped lice and fleas. Wet garments caused illness. Heavy cloaks stiffened in winter cold. The body carried the marks of labor, and the clothing made it harder, not easier. But there was no alternative. For everyday Tudors, clothing wasn't about status. It was about endurance. The emotional divide. If elite fashion imprisoned the wealthy, practical fashion limited the poor. One class suffered under excessive layers and weight. The other suffered under scarcity and necessity. One class used clothing to climb the social ladder. The other used it just to survive the climb of daily life. The result: a society where clothing defined identity, class shaped silhouette, reputation shaped color, and station shaped comfort. Whether rich or poor, everyone wore a story on their back. And that story was never silent. The Tudor world is half a millennium behind us. Their ruffs have disappeared. Their farthingales are museum relics. Their corsets have been replaced with gym wear and stretchy fabric. And yet, the fashion paradox they lived with still whispers through our modern lives. Because although the materials changed, cotton replaced velvet, polyester replaced wool, sportswear replaced stays, the psychology remains hauntingly familiar. The human need to be seen. Why did Tudor nobles endure 10-pound gowns, suffocating ruffs, and jewels that dug into the skin? Because being seen meant being recognized. Being recognized meant having value, and that impulse hasn't gone anywhere. Today, we might not wear a collar the size of a dinner plate, but we still curate outfits, hairstyles, accessories, photos, online profiles, personal branding, first impressions. Just like a Tudor noble carefully selected the right gown for court, we carefully select the right clothing for work, dating, social events, and digital spaces. The Tudors dressed for their world. We dress for ours. But the motive is the same. We all want to belong. Status symbols evolve, but they never disappear. A Tudor might show status with gold thread sleeves. Today, someone might show status with designer shoes, a luxury watch, a trending outfit, a new hairstyle, curated Instagram photos, the latest smartphone. The symbols change. The desire does not. Both periods reward the same behavior: visibility, presentation, the illusion of effortlessness built on immense effort. And just like Tudor courtiers, we often judge people based on clothing long before we know them. The ruff may be gone, but the instinct remains. The politics of appearance. In the Tudor age, clothing dictated class, marriageability, respect, trust, moral standing. Today, clothing influences job interviews, social perception, dating decisions, first impressions, assumptions of wealth, assumptions of intelligence, assumptions of character. We don't have sumptuary laws anymore, but we still have visible social rules. The Tudor court had color codes. We have dress codes. They had ruffs to signal humility or magnificence. We have office wear, uniforms, and red carpet looks. Even now, a person in a suit is judged differently from a person in casual clothing. Narrator, we may not call them laws, but appearance still governs opportunity. Fashion as a cage, then and now. The Tudors were trapped in their clothing, but in our own way, aren't we still trapped in the expectations of modern fashion? Think of the pressure to appear professional, the expectation to look put together, the judgment on social media, the comparison culture embedded in online images, the guilt tied to buying or not buying certain clothes. The corset may be gone, but a psychological corset remains. The farthingale may be gone, but people still shape their bodies to fit trends. Shapewear, waist trainers, extreme fitness aesthetics. The embroidered sleeves may be gone, but we still alter our style to avoid judgment. Just like Tudor nobles, we often sacrifice comfort for acceptance. The price of beauty in the modern world. The Tudors spent fortunes on fabric and jewels. We spend fortunes on fast fashion, designer brands, beauty products, influencers' recommendations, online shopping trends, curated wardrobes, retail therapy. Their garments caused fainting, heat exhaustion, chronic pain, bruised ribs, stiff necks. Today, modern fashion causes body image stress, trend anxiety, financial strain, social pressure, digital comparison, self-esteem issues. Different era, same trap. The cost of looking good never truly disappeared. It simply changed shape. Reclaiming comfort, a luxury the Tudors never had. One thing separates us from the Tudors: choice. We can choose comfort, we can choose style, we can choose minimalism or extravagance, we can choose clothing that expresses rather than restricts. Tudor fashion didn't offer choice, it offered obligation. Today, rejecting uncomfortable fashion is a form of freedom they never knew. Imagine showing a Tudor woman yoga leggings. Imagine showing a Tudor man a soft cotton shirt. Imagine telling them they could wear whatever color they liked. It would be unbelievable, liberating, revolutionary. Comfort, to them, would feel like a miracle. Breaking the cycle, learning from the Tudors. The lesson is simple but profound. Fashion can elevate us or imprison us. It depends on why we wear it. The Tudors dressed out of obligation. We dress out of expectation. But both systems rely on the same engine: the fear of being judged, the fear of standing out for the wrong reason, the fear of not fitting in. This is the echo of Tudor fashion, the part that never fades. A mirror across time. When you look at a portrait of Elizabeth I with her towering ruff and glittering gown, you may admire the beauty, but remember the weight, the tightness, the heat, the discomfort, the strain carried beneath her regal appearance. Then compare it to how we present ourselves, the photos we edit, the outfits we choose, the sacrifices we make, the image we curate for others. Different tools, same instincts. The Tudors lived in a world that valued image over comfort, and even today, in a world with far greater freedom, we still wrestle with the same paradox. Clothing will always shape the body, but how much of the body and how much of the soul we allow it to shape is up to us. We began this journey with a question: could you survive a single day in Tudor clothing? Now, after walking through the layers, the weight, the restrictions, the hierarchy, the pressure, and the pain, you've seen the truth. Tudor fashion wasn't simply beautiful, it was demanding, controlling, exhausting, and for many, suffocating. Every gown carried a burden, every doublet carried an image, every ruff carried a message, every silhouette carried a consequence. In the Tudor world, clothing defined you before your voice did. Before your actions, before your character, it shaped how others judged you and how you judged yourself. It gave power, but also took freedom. It elevated status, but crushed comfort. It created beauty, but hid suffering. And yet beneath all the velvet and embroidery, the same human heart beat, the same longing for acceptance, belonging, and recognition that exists in our world today. Because even now, 500 years later, we still curate our image. We still worry about first impressions. We still chase trends. We still fear judgment. We still decorate ourselves to feel worthy. We may not endure whalebone stays or towering ruffs, but we still wear invisible expectations as tightly as they wore theirs. So perhaps the real question isn't whether you could survive a day in Tudor clothing. Perhaps the question is this: how much do we still let clothing and all the expectations around it shape who we believe we're allowed to be? Because the Tudors remind us of a timeless truth: fashion can free us or imprison us. It depends on whether we wear it for ourselves or for the world watching us. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden world of Tudor fashion, there are countless more stories waiting to be told. The scandals, the hygiene secrets, the medical horrors, the royal tragedies. All the pieces of history they never taught us in school. So subscribe, explore the channel, and join us as we continue uncovering the untold, the uncomfortable, and the unforgettable stories that shaped our past. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just dates and portraits. It's a mirror, and sometimes it still fits.